This is
And
Talking Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad. And I'm Yves Engler. Today we're talking about Donald Trump and Ukraine as we approach 3-year anniversary of Russia's invasion. Trump has thrown the NATO proxy war into doubt. His defense secretary told the Ukraine contact group this week that Russia won't return or Ukraine won't return to pre-2014 borders and that Ukraine won't be joining NATO. On Thursday, Donald Trump said, I don't see any way that a country in Russia's position could allow them, meaning Ukraine, to join NATO. I believe that's the reason the war started, because Biden went out and said that they could join NATO. To discuss recent developments, we have the great pleasure to have Paul Robinson, who is a professor of public and international affairs at the University of Ottawa, a author of many books on Russia, Eastern Europe. First of all, thanks for coming on Talking Foreign Policy. And can you just sort of what's your reaction to these developments of the past few days with regards to the Trump administration and Ukraine?
well, thank you for inviting me. I'm still not totally optimistic about the prospects of peace in Ukraine. I think there's still obviously many barriers going forward, but I'm marginally less pessimistic this week than I was last week due to these recent developments. I think that first of all, Trump's phone call to Putin and the announcement that negotiations will begin is an important step forward because you can't even begin to have peace till you start talking. So the fact that talking is going to start is a major positive development. Also, I think that Pete Hegseth's speech was a quite necessary dose of realism into the conversation, and something which should have been said a while back. Unfortunately, we do seem to have had a little bit of backtracking since then by Vice President Vance. So, of course, it's not entirely clear that all the administration is speaking with one voice. Nonetheless, I think that there's some positive signs, and that what we've seen of what the press is saying is Trump's peace plan, while certainly imperfect and will certainly leave both sides unsatisfied, is at least a reasonable starting point for negotiations.
And what's your response? So to Chrystia Freeland. So I looked for Melanie Joly's response to some of this, and she hasn't responded, Canada's foreign minister. But Chrystia Freeland, who's deputy prime minister, recently stepped down, deputy prime minister, former foreign minister, and is of course running to be leader of the Liberal Party, which would make her prime minister. She responded, excuse me, immediately saying in response to Pete Hessig's NATO comment, Canada stands steadfast with Ukraine and brave people of Ukraine who are on the front lines of the fight against tyranny. It is in the interest of all democracies to support them. Ukraine must become a full member of NATO. And she also has another tweet responding to Trump saying about Russia joining the G7 or would be the G8, coming back into the G8, and she said, "We will Russia will never join." And it goes on to say, "We will not turn a blind eye to war crimes and attacks on other countries' sovereignty." I think there's probably a lot of people that have been paying attention to what's been happening in Gaza recently and would find that hard to take too seriously about other countries' sovereignty. But what's your reaction to Freeland? This seems like, quite frankly, unhelpful. I mean, it's clear that this is, Ukrainians have been, killed in large numbers, and it's all very horrible. But to just keep it going on forever, the idea that that's the pro-Ukraine position seems very odd. What do you make of Friedland's response to this?
It doesn't altogether surprise me, given her previous positions on this. I think the Americans may find that they're not necessarily in a position to force anything on either Ukraine or Russia. And in academic literature on war termination, they talk about what are called spoilers, and these are outside parties who try to, or it could be parties within a state, which try to spoil any peace process. And I think the Americans may well find that certain European countries, particularly Poland, Baltic states, maybe the United Kingdom too, and Canada under some leaderships, could very well end up playing the role of spoilers. So that even if the Americans are saying, we will not support you in NATO, you must make peace, these countries will say to them, no, you can still join NATO. We will give you any weapons the Americans don't give you. You should keep on fighting, and therefore encourage, further sense of unrealism in Kiev, and basically get in the way of any peace processes. So I think this is very possible. I don't think, as you say, it is helpful because it's really not based in military reality, and the situation as it stands is not catastrophically bleak for the Ukrainian army. I mean, even if the Americans withdraw support, they will still have sufficient weapons from Europe and so on to keep fighting for a while, but it will be a downward trajectory, and it still is a downward trajectory. So there's really, saying we will support you to the bitter end, does raise questions about what that end is and whether it's actually a favorable one and whether it would actually not be better to cut losses right now.
Yeah, it seems sort of quite cheap to be sitting 10,000 kilometers away and pounding your chest about Ukraine till the end or Ukraine joining NATO and all kinds of very unrealistic sounding things and saying you are the defender of U Ukraine. That seems like an odd kind of position, but it has been heavily the position of Canadian politicians over the past few years, and for that matter, actually before past 3 years. But so you kind of get into that. So where do you see this going, right? Like the Ukrainian military has not been defeated. It's obviously been very much weakened, and there's been huge losses. We're seeing stories about them offering $24,000 to young men to join these big bonuses. That's a new thing apparently in recent days because they're having difficulty getting people to join. They've obviously lost around 20% or so of the country to Russian forces. But they still, have a big military. They're still fighting. They stories reports about the effectiveness of the drones as a even without many men able to, infantry to cover all the front line, that the drones are quite effective in stopping Russian advances and the like. So yeah, where do you sort of see this kind of going at the military level? Do you think it's plausible that Russia could still go as far as Odessa, which I know is kind of somewhat of a maybe not the most maximalist Russian hope, but a somewhat maximalist Russian hope. And then I guess also at the sort of political level of how serious do you think Putin is going to take the recent moves of Trump?
So I think it rather implausible the Russian army would advance as far as Odessa. I find it rather implausible that they would even be able to advance as far as the Dnieper River and towns such as Dnipro, former Dnipropetrovsk. Sorry, I'm quite a difficult one to pronounce that one. Zaporozhye and so on. They're just not showing that they have the capability to do that. That would only really be possible if the attritional process continues for really quite a considerable time longer, possibly several years, at the end of which there is some sort of Ukrainian collapse, because, maybe a bit like the German army in August 1918, when just you reach that sort of crunch point where it can no longer really hold together, right? So that is the only way that could happen, and that would require for really very, very long period of continuing slow grinding advances by the Russians. So if I was to predict, and I don't like predicting war because it is, as Clausewitz said, it's the realm of uncertainty. One never knows for sure what's going to happen. But if we were to continue current trends, then the most likely prospect for 2025 is continued slow grinding Russian advances, taking one, small village and town after another, but no significant breakthrough. And if the war is meant to continue into 2026, probably more of the same. So I think we're going to see Ukraine continuing to be on the back foot. And the longer the war goes on, obviously, even the more more Ukrainians die, the more Russians die, but also the more land Ukrainian Ukraine loses, and the more its infrastructure is destroyed. Now, obviously, the Ukrainians also have the ability to inflict considerable damage on the Russians, not just with the short-range drones, but increasingly with long-range drones, which are able to hit Russian infrastructure far in the rear. That's likely to increase too, so the cost to Russia will increase as time goes on. But the cost to Ukraine will probably be higher, and it will be the Ukrainians most likely be on the back foot for the foreseeable future.
And do you think that so do you think that the Russians are into they want a negotiated solution? Do you think that Trump's going to have success in sort of pushing this with Putin?
Well, I think for the Russians, the key point is, I mean, they've always said that they will support negotiations. Whether they will um, agree to a peace treaty, though, is dependent upon them, I think, being convinced that any peace treaty is permanent. There is huge mutual suspicion on both sides. So the Ukrainians fear that any peace treaty will not be permanent, and then Russia will attack again. But similarly, the Russians, based on the what happened at Minsk One and Minsk Two, fear that if there is a ceasefire which doesn't resolve all the underlying issues, then that ceasefire will be used by Ukraine to rearm with Western weapons, and then launch the war again to regain its lost territory. So I think that the stumbling point for the Russians is some sort of guarantee that whatever settlement happens is a permanent one, which precludes that sort of scenario. And whether that's possible to achieve in the short term is hard to see right now, because the Ukrainians also want guarantees that the ceasefire will be permanent, but whatever acts as a guarantee for Ukraine in that matter almost acts as an anti-guarantee for the Russians. So a guarantee for the Ukrainians would be, continuing weapons, NATO membership, things like that. But those are the very things that, for the Russians, spark fears that Ukraine could rearm and strike again. So therefore, what reassures one side has the opposite of reassurance for the other side, and therefore it's very hard to see at the moment how they'll come together. The peace plan we're seeing tries to square that particular circle by giving each side a little bit, but whether that's sufficient for either side, we'll have to see. I'm not overly optimistic, but at least a start is being made.
And just to conclude on this is for principally a Canadian audience. So we mentioned that Canada is a potential spoiler. So I guess for Canadians who want to see an end to what has been this highly destructive and horrible war, so what we should be doing is pressuring our government, say no, Canada is spoiler, or any thoughts on that? What Canadians should be doing?
Well, I think we should, as a country, Canada should be using. It obviously has some influence on the Ukrainian side. We don't have any influence on the Russian side, largely because, of course, we've cut all contacts with them. So our ability to put pressure or to give positive inducements to the Russians are pretty much zero. We can, however, exert some leverage on the Ukrainian side, and I think our influence there should be used to instill some sort of sense of realism and say, look, guys, this can't go on forever. It's not in your benefit to go on forever. We're not willing to support you forever. You need to make peace now. That's what we should be doing. I very, 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 very much doubt we will.
Well, on that note, thanks a lot, Paul Robinson, Professor, International Affairs, University of Ottawa. Thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy.
My pleasure.